everybody. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm going to read an article that I wrote a couple weeks ago before we get out of the month of September. It's called September 11th, I Was There, and I would like to read it for you. Back in July, I was reading an article by Naomi Wolf, a famous intellectual and former New Yorker. She was writing about Jeffrey Epstein and how she had crossed paths with him over the years at various Manhattan events organized by Peggy Siegel, his longtime publicist. I about fell out of my chair. I worked for Peggy Siegel back in the summer of 2000. It was my first job out of college. It was 8 years before Epstein would be convicted of sex crimes, long before he would be widely suspected of being an international human trafficker, arms trafficking Mossad agent, island dwelling, globe trotting, DNA spreading, temple building, Satan worshipping, shape shifting lizard person. I think I once sent Jeffrey Epstein to voicemail and got in trouble for it. But that was 24 years ago, 25 years ago now, and it's hard to say for sure. I soon left the glitz and glamour of Soho, that's in quotes, glitz and glamour, and took a job at a tech startup in the financial district, working half a block away from the World Trade Center. I was running late for work one day and emerged from the subway to see one of the buildings smoking. It is strange when your life intersects with the world historical. Twice. And I suppose I believe that because I was downtown that morning and on the island of Manhattan that day, I have a right to say a few things about it. I want to tell you what I remember, leaving out the emotional experience, as that has, I believe, been exploited for far too long. First, I often ate lunch in the World Trade Center Plaza, and I can tell you, they were not towers. They were vertical cities, each extending over a quarter of a mile into the atmosphere. At night, they were like two solar systems blinking above you. Think of the opening scene in Star Wars, when the rebel ship is being pursued by the Imperial Star Destroyer. A regular Manhattan office building would be like the rebel ship, and the World Trade Center like the Imperial Star Destroyer. That's how big those buildings were. When you looked up from the plaza, it just kept going and going and going. After seeing the black smoke billowing, I eventually rode the subway north to Union Station, Union Square, 14th Street, where my friend worked. She came running up to me. She said, "What do you know? Do you know that the first tower fell?" I will never forget the way this word did not compute. I will never forget. Fell, I said? What do you mean it fell? The streets in downtown Manhattan are winding and narrow. The real estate is extremely expensive. The buildings are packed together, and many of them were small and old. You've played Jenga, right? What I pictured in my mind was no different than if a small nuclear bomb had gone off. If one of those towers had fallen, then the financial district would surely no longer be. Part of me wondered if it might have caused some kind of earthquake, and if the entire lower section of Manhattan might be about to just break off and sink into the river. That's how big they were. She took me to a room where everyone was gathered around a television, and I saw the footage for the first time. It didn't topple. It didn't wobble, spill, crack, or crumble in a chaotic manner over a period of hours or days. It sank swiftly into itself in a matter of seconds. We decided to walk to the apartment of one of my friend's colleagues. As we were crossing what I believe was 6th Avenue, we had a direct line of sight to the second tower, which was 3 miles away. It was 3 miles away, and we could see it quite clearly. That's how big they were. People started screaming. That one didn't fall either. It turned into a plume of dust. After 2 or 3 weeks, my office building had been deemed structurally sound. I was allowed to go back and get my things. I believe I got off at the Fulton Street subway stop. When I emerged, I didn't know where I was. There were skyscrapers where there had previously been a small village. The visual perspective of everything had changed so dramatically. I was completely disoriented. It would be like if you lived in a small town in the Rocky Mountains, and then one day they removed the mountains. That's how big those buildings were. When I finally found my office, the door swung easily on its hinges, the elevator worked, everything appeared exactly as I'd left it, not even a scratch on the windows. I gathered up my files and personal belongings, and someone took me up to the roof. I looked down on two pits filled with rubble and debris piled up no higher than 2 stories. One building on the perimeter had suffered some damage. That's it. How could a galactic space station explode half a block away from you and not do any damage to the things around it? The buildings were 150 stories tall. There were 10 million square feet of office space. Each tower weighed over 250,000 tons. Looking down, I had one thought I will never forget. Where did it all go? I was living in Astoria, Queens at the time and training for the New York City Marathon, so I was getting up every morning and running. The dust from Ground Zero, which was almost 10 miles away, remained in the air for a very long time, even as far as Queens, for well over a month. For many weeks, from my elevated train station in Astoria, I could see 2 pillars of smoke rising from where the towers used to be. It rained, the weather changed, it got colder, and still, over a month later, those 2 pillars of smoke were still rising every day like ghosts. The other thing I will never forget is the image on television of President George W. Bush being told about the attack while reading a story to a room full of kindergartners. That always struck me as ironic and symbolic, because that is largely what the office of the President of the United States entails: telling stories. There were a few stories we were later told. It had all melted and burned away from 2 planes worth of jet fuel. Or China had come and hauled away all the steel. Or the pits underneath the towers were very, very deep, and all of that stuff had just kind of fallen down there into Tartarus. A quick Google search will tell you that the pits under the towers were only 6 stories deep. But it's not worth getting into all of that, because someone will just come along and say, no, they weren't, they were deeper. It's not worth getting into the weeds on 9/11, mainly because the agents of disinformation are very effective at clouding the space. There's really only one thing you need to know and never forget about September 11th, which will tell you everything you need to know about September 11th. The media reported that, quote, one of the hijackers' passports has been found blocks from the World Trade Center, unquote. If you can believe that the jet fuel from 2 planes managed to turn 500,000 tons of matter into dust and get the ground so hot that it would still be smoking a month later, but wouldn't burn up a passport that had been in one of the planes, then you would probably also believe that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. Finally, beware of sentimentality on September 11th. Those who say never forget are usually the ones who most desperately want to control what we remember.